January 2015, a quiet suburban neighborhood in New Jersey was blanketed in the coolness of an early winter morning. Snow still covered the sidewalks, though its surface had been tamped down by the frequent footsteps of local residents. The street lights flickered faintly as Alice White, a seasoned housekeeper, carefully parked her aging Toyota Camry outside the home of Pastor Henry Doyle. For Alice, this house felt like a second home. She had been working here for over 5 years and knew every habit of the pastor. Henry was a man of routine. By 6 in the morning, he would already be sipping his coffee, and by 10 at night, the lights in his study would always go out. But today, something was different. The windows of Henry's study were still lit, even as the sun slowly crept over the horizon. This small detail immediately set Alice on edge. She stepped out of her car, adjusting her leather gloves, and made her way quickly to the front door, which was always left unlocked for her early visits. There was no reason for alarm, but an unshakable feeling of unease began to creep into her thoughts. Inside, the house was unusually quiet. Normally, the soft strains of classical music played on the living room radio, and the kitchen carried the inviting aroma of freshly ground coffee. But now the atmosphere felt tense. Alice noticed papers scattered across the living room floor, a stark contrast to the neat and orderly Henry she had always known. She scanned the room, trying to make sense of the disarray. On the kitchen table sat an empty bottle of expensive wine, with a toppled glass beside it, leaving a red stain on the white tablecloth. These were items she had never seen in this house before. "Henry," Alice called out, her voice echoing through the house like a faint cry in an empty cave. No answer. Her heart began to race. She decided to head upstairs to the pastor's study. The wooden stairs creaked slightly beneath her feet. The higher she climbed, the more she felt the weight of something being terribly wrong. The study door was ajar, and warm yellow light spilled out into the dark hallway. Holding her breath, Alice stepped into the room. On the carpet, Pastor Henry's body lay motionless. The room's air seemed to hum with an oppressive tension, and the sight before her was undeniable. On the desk beside him lay a pen and a sheet of paper, but the writing was smudged and illegible due to a spilled cup of coffee. Alice felt frozen, her body refusing to move. Her mind initially rejected the scene before her, but then reality crashed down in a wave of panic. Trembling, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Someone, Pastor Henry's dead," she stammered, her voice cracking with shock and fear. The operator tried to calm her, but it seemed impossible. All Alice could do was sit on the staircase, waiting for the police to arrive, avoiding the urge to look back toward the study. The arrival of law enforcement shattered the quiet morning of the neighborhood. Police cars with flashing lights filled the street, and curious neighbors, stirred by the commotion, peeked out from their windows. Alice gave her statement, but her mind raced with a single thought: who could have done this to Henry? Pastor Doyle was known for his kind demeanor and his willingness to help anyone who sought his guidance. The news of Henry Doyle's death spread quickly throughout the community, leaving shock in its wake. To many, he was not just a pastor. He was a mentor, a friend, a moral compass. Yet the detectives who began their investigation knew that beneath every perfect facade might lie hidden secrets. What initially appeared to be a straightforward crime of personal vengeance soon unraveled into a mystery that made everyone question who Henry Doyle truly was. This event marked the beginning of one of the most talked about tragedies in the nation. Detective Thomas King arrived at Pastor Henry Doyle's estate around 9 in the morning. A tall man with a piercing gaze, King was well known for his analytical mind and his ability to notice details others often overlooked. He stood by his car for a moment, studying the house's exterior. At first glance, it was the picture of respectability: a 2-story home with neatly trimmed hedges and a decorative wreath on the front door. But within its walls lurked an atmosphere that starkly contradicted its outward appearance. Thomas stepped inside and quickly surveyed the scene. The police had cordoned off the study with yellow tape, while the living room and kitchen remained empty but told their own story of recent chaos. His attention was immediately drawn to the papers scattered on the living room table. They appeared to be notes, resembling financial records, but several sheets had been torn, and portions of the text were covered with correction fluid. Thomas picked up one of the intact papers and saw a partially completed chart related to financial transactions. What was the pastor doing with this, he thought, as he instinctively jotted down a few notes in his notebook. In the kitchen, his attention was caught by the empty bottle of expensive wine, an item that seemed out of place for a man known for his modest lifestyle. He examined the bottle closely and noticed fingerprints smudged on the glass. Motioning to one of the forensic experts on site, he gave a curt instruction. "Check this bottle. It might be important," he said before heading upstairs. In the pastor's study, Thomas immediately noticed several items that cast shadows on Henry's otherwise spotless reputation. On the desk lay a handwritten letter, though it was unsigned. It was addressed to M. The words were cautious, as if Henry had been trying to mask his true emotions. "I can't go on with this, no matter how much I want to. We're risking too much." Thomas read, piecing together an image of a situation far more complex than it first appeared. On a shelf among the books, Thomas found a box filled with expensive jewelry, bracelets, rings, and earrings. These items felt completely out of place in the life of a humble pastor. Another detail caught his eye, a woman's scarf draped over the back of the chair. It was made of lightweight fabric and carried the faint scent of perfume, a stark contrast to the air in the study. The scarf appeared as if it had been left behind in haste. What surprised Thomas the most, however, were the photographs decorating the study walls. Most of them depicted Henry among his parishioners at events or charity functions. But one photograph stood out. It showed Henry embracing a woman whom Thomas did not recognize. Her eyes stared directly at the camera, her lips curved in a faint smile that seemed to hold a mix of joy and apprehension. "Do you know who this is?" Thomas asked a junior officer nearby. "No, sir, but we'll find out," the officer replied, jotting down a note. Thomas lingered on the photo for a moment longer. Whoever this woman was, she clearly played a significant role in Henry's life. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of neighbors being questioned outside the house. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Mason, claimed to have seen a mysterious woman hurrying into the pastor's home the evening before his death. "She had dark hair and looked very elegant," Mrs. Mason reported, visibly unsettled. "But when I said hello, she just nodded and rushed to the door." This testimony provided the first real lead. Thomas began tracing possible connections, and soon the investigation uncovered a name: Mila Harper, a woman unfamiliar to most of the neighbors, but one who would soon become the center of national attention. The investigation quickly led to the name Mila Harper, which first surfaced after testimonies from the pastor's neighbors. Mila, a 36-year-old wife of influential businessman Oscar Harper, was well known in New Jersey's elite circles for her elegance and charm. She frequently attended charity events, public gatherings, and private dinners, leaving a lasting impression as a cultured and sophisticated woman. To the public, she seemed the perfect companion for a powerful man. However, her connection to the pastor's death caused a public uproar, as the suspicion of involvement in such a crime was entirely at odds with her impeccable social image. Detectives began to dig into her past and her connection to Pastor Henry Doyle. It was revealed that Mila had first met Henry at a charity gala hosted by a local church about a year prior. As always, Henry had been the center of attention, inspiring people with his words. It is believed that this was when their relationship began, later evolving into regular meetings. Officially, their encounters were described as spiritual counseling. Mila reportedly sought the pastor's guidance to cope with personal struggles in her marriage to Oscar Harper, a man with a reputation for being controlling and domineering. The details of their meetings remained unclear, but sources close to the pastor confirmed that Mila visited his study at least twice a month. Neighbors also reported seeing her car parked outside Henry's house on several occasions. These were short visits that always took place in the evening while Oscar was occupied with business affairs. Investigators began to suspect that these meetings may have been more than simple counseling sessions. At the same time, acquaintances of Mila and her husband revealed long-standing problems in their marriage. Oscar Harper, a 52-year-old owner of several construction firms, was known for his demanding nature. He was described as excessively controlling, particularly toward his wife. Mila was reportedly forbidden from leaving the house without his permission. Her phone was regularly checked, and most of her contacts were closely monitored by Oscar. This information provided investigators with a key insight. Her relationship with Henry might not only have been a sanctuary, but also a form of escape from her husband's controlling grip. The investigation team obtained a copy of the investigator's report, which confirmed that Mila had continued visiting Henry's home despite Oscar's explicit prohibition. Notably, one of these visits took place just a few days before the pastor's death. This strengthened the suspicion that there was indeed an emotional relationship between the two. The phone records from Mila's last week before Henry's death revealed more. She had called the pastor multiple times, sometimes late at night. The last call occurred the night before the tragedy, further raising suspicions. During her interrogation, Mila admitted to being at Henry's house that evening, but claimed to have left before the incident occurred. She insisted that their meeting was solely to discuss personal difficulties she was facing, which the pastor was advising her on. Although her alibi appeared tenuous, the police didn't have sufficient evidence to charge her. After the interrogation, she returned to her home, but detectives continued to keep a close watch on her. Mila Harper remained a focal point of the investigation. Her mysterious demeanor, strained marriage, and romantic entanglement with the pastor became central to the puzzle that threatened to unravel not only her reputation, but also the lives of many others. Detectives knew one thing for sure. Solving this crime would require unearthing every secret Mila had worked so hard to keep hidden. Oscar Harper became the next critical figure in the investigation. His name surfaced after detectives reviewed reports from the private investigator he had hired to surveil his wife. Investigators began delving into Oscar's personality, his reputation, his relationship with Mila, and his potential motive for Pastor Henry Doyle's murder. Detective Thomas King, leading the investigation, decided to question Oscar personally. During the interview, the businessman exuded complete self-control. His tone was cold but polite, his answers brief and calculated. When asked about Mila and her relationship with Pastor Doyle, Oscar was evasive, emphasizing that their interactions were solely for spiritual guidance. However, his rigid body language, folded arms, and avoidance of eye contact betrayed his discomfort. Thomas noticed that every detail in Oscar's responses seemed overly rehearsed, as if he had anticipated and prepared for this conversation. Further suspicions arose when investigators reviewed Oscar's phone records. On the day of the murder, his cell phone was deactivated for several hours, only to reappear miles away from his office later that evening. Oscar explained this as work-related errands and meetings, but failed to provide evidence to back his claims. To Thomas, it was clear that Oscar was hiding something, but there wasn't yet enough evidence to prove it. A search of Oscar's office provided another significant clue. Inside his safe, investigators found a copy of the private investigator's report he had commissioned. The report included photographs and time-stamped details, confirming that Mila had continued meeting with Henry despite Oscar's direct prohibition. One of these encounters occurred just days before the pastor's death. The documents also revealed that Oscar had personally followed his wife on multiple occasions, underscoring his obsessive need to control her every move. Further deepening suspicions, investigators discovered that Oscar had contacted his lawyer multiple times in the days leading up to Henry's death. This raised the possibility that Oscar had been preparing for potential legal complications, a preparation that could suggest premeditation. The situation took a more dramatic turn when Mila Harper unexpectedly disappeared. Her phone was turned off, and none of her friends or relatives could account for her whereabouts. Thomas suspected that she had fled, either out of fear for her life or to avoid further questioning. The investigation centered on the motives and behaviors of both Mila and Oscar. Simultaneously, detectives considered whether Henry Doyle had other enemies who might have exploited the situation. However, mounting evidence increasingly pointed to the crime being the result of a volatile love triangle in which all three parties harbored secrets and motives. Jealousy, manipulation, and control formed a dangerous mix. Oscar Harper emerged as a man who would go to any lengths to maintain power over his wife. But Detective Thomas King understood that the case would only progress with more concrete evidence, evidence that could finally bring this tangled web of lies and emotions to light. Mila Harper's disappearance was an unexpected twist that further complicated the investigation. She was last seen at home the evening after her police interrogation. She hadn't informed any friends or family of her plans, and her phone remained switched off. For Detective Thomas King, this was a deeply troubling development. The disappearance of a key suspect could mean one of several things. Either she feared for her life, was trying to avoid further questioning, or someone had helped her vanish. The investigation branched out into multiple directions. Detectives examined her most recent contacts, while also probing the possibility of Oscar Harper's involvement in her disappearance. Surveillance footage from the cameras near the Harpers' home yielded no suspicious activity. Only Mila's car was seen leaving the driveway around 10 p.m. But after that, the trail went cold. Police also searched the house for any notes or clues that might explain her actions, but no evidence was found. This only added to the growing mystery. 3 days later, when the search seemed to be at a standstill, police received a tip about a woman matching Mila's description. She was found in a small motel outside the city, about an hour's drive from New Jersey. When Thomas King and his team arrived at the scene, they encountered a completely different Mila. She looked tired and unkempt. A far cry from the elegant and composed woman everyone had described. Mila was visibly frightened but cooperative with the investigators. She explained her disappearance by saying she feared for her life. According to her account, Henry Doyle had recently told her that their relationship needed to end. He was afraid that Oscar might have discovered their secret and warned Mila that they were risking too much. She claimed that Henry's fear had unsettled her deeply. Mila also admitted that she had been at the pastor's house on the evening before his death. She said their conversation had ended in an argument, after which she left. She maintained that she had no knowledge of what happened afterward. Thomas listened carefully, but there were still many gaps in her story. For instance, she couldn't clearly explain why she didn't return home after hearing about Henry's death, or why she decided to hide in a motel. According to Mila, the night of the tragedy, she received a phone call from Oscar. He asked her where she was and made cryptic remarks suggesting he knew about her meeting with Henry. Meanwhile, the investigation uncovered new evidence. Forensic analysis of the wine bottle found at the crime scene revealed fingerprints belonging to Oscar Harper. This was a significant lead, confirming that Oscar had been at the pastor's house on the night of the murder. Additionally, surveillance cameras from another part of town captured Oscar's car driving in the direction of Henry's home roughly an hour after Mila had left. This strongly suggested that both Oscar and Mila had been at the house that night, albeit at different times, though their exact roles remained unclear. At this point, the investigation had more questions than answers. Mila denied any involvement in the crime, but her erratic behavior and omissions made her a person of interest. Oscar, on the other hand, was keeping secrets, yet mounting evidence increasingly pointed to his potential involvement. Thomas King understood that the case would only move forward if one of them broke and revealed the truth. The key breakthrough in the investigation came when forensic analysts completed their examination of the evidence collected at Pastor Henry Doyle's home. The most critical piece turned out to be the fingerprints on the wine bottle found in the study. They belonged to Oscar Harper, definitively placing him at the scene on the night of the murder. For Detective Thomas King, this was the first concrete link tying Oscar directly to the crime. However, the fingerprints only proved his presence, not the act itself, meaning more evidence was needed to establish his guilt. Another crucial lead emerged from the team reviewing surveillance footage from the neighborhood. One recording taken late that evening showed a vehicle matching the description of Oscar's car. The camera captured it at 10:48 p.m., about an hour after Mila had left Henry's home. This suggested that Oscar had entered the property shortly after her departure. For Thomas, this was no coincidence. A clear timeline began to form. Oscar, consumed by jealousy after learning about his wife's meeting with Henry, had likely gone to confront the pastor. Adding further weight to the investigation, police discovered an important item in a pond near Henry's estate. Forensic analysis confirmed it was connected to the suspect, becoming another piece of the puzzle. With these discoveries, the case against Oscar Harper grew stronger, and detectives were now able to seek an arrest warrant. However, Thomas King was determined not to act prematurely. He understood that Oscar was a seasoned and influential man who had likely prepared a defense. Instead of rushing to arrest him, Thomas decided to conduct one more interrogation, using the newly uncovered evidence to apply strategic pressure. During the questioning, Thomas methodically presented the findings. He began with the wine bottle, then moved to the surveillance footage. Oscar maintained his composure at first, but subtle cracks began to show. His responses became more clipped, and his previously confident demeanor grew strained. At the same time, detectives continued questioning Mila Harper. While her story seemed to align with some of the evidence, it still left many unanswered questions. Yet Thomas noticed a shift in her behavior after she learned about the evidence implicating Oscar. She became more cooperative, though fear still held her back from directly accusing her husband. She admitted that their marriage had been tumultuous for years and that Oscar had threatened her on multiple occasions, especially when he suspected her of infidelity. Mila also confirmed that on the night of Henry's death, Oscar had been unusually agitated and was keeping close tabs on her movements. Although she claimed not to know he had followed her to the pastor's house, her growing fear of his actions seemed genuine. Piece by piece, the investigation painted a clear picture. Sire, Aishan, driven by jealousy and a need to control his wife, had gone to confront Henry. The confrontation turned violent, leading to the pastor's death. The use of a knife suggested an impulsive act of rage, but the presence of the wine bottle and other stage details hinted at an attempt to cover his tracks, perhaps even to implicate Mila. His behavior in the days following the crime also aligned with the profile of someone trying to conceal their involvement. The final breakthrough came when Thomas King meticulously organized all the evidence into a chronological narrative. The chain of events became undeniable. After Mila left the pastor's home around 9:30 p.m., Oscar arrived roughly an hour later. Henry was found dead just a few hours after that. The forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, and the timeline all pointed squarely to Oscar as the perpetrator. Based on the overwhelming evidence, an arrest warrant was issued. Oscar Harper was taken into custody and formally charged with the premeditated murder of Pastor Henry Doyle. For Thomas, this moment marked the culmination of weeks of painstaking work. Yet he knew the battle wasn't over. Oscar was a man of means and influence, and his defense team would likely mount a formidable case. Still, with the weight of the evidence on their side, Thomas and his team were confident they had uncovered the truth about what happened that fateful night. The trial of Oscar Harper began several months after his arrest. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, members of the public, and even those who had once viewed Oscar as a model of success gathered to hear the details of this sensational case. Oscar's reputation, like Mila's, had been utterly destroyed. While she was seen more as a victim of circumstances, Oscar was regarded as a man who had lost his moral compass due to his obsession with control. The prosecution built their case on the strong evidence collected during the investigation. The prosecutor opened by arguing that the crime was not an impulsive act, but a premeditated one. Oscar, having learned of his wife's relationship with Pastor Henry Doyle, decided to punish the man he saw as the source of his humiliation. The prosecution emphasized the fingerprints found on the wine bottle, the surveillance footage capturing Oscar's car near the pastor's home, and most damningly, the day evidence on the knife used in the murder. These pieces of evidence, they argued, formed an irrefutable chain linking Oscar to the crime. Mila Harper's testimony played a crucial role in the trial. She took the stand as a key witness, recounting the years of control and emotional abuse she had endured in her marriage to Oscar. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of a man consumed by jealousy and power. Mila detailed how Oscar frequently checked her phone, restricted her movements, and constantly monitored her interactions. She also described the phone call she received from him on the night of the murder, where his tone made her fear for her safety. She told the court that this call was the reason she fled her home and went into hiding. The defense attempted to portray Oscar as a man who had acted under extreme emotional stress. They argued that discovering his wife's betrayal had driven him to a moment of irrationality. The defense team also sought to discredit Mila, accusing her of provoking the situation by hiding the truth from her husband and engaging in a relationship with the pastor. However, this line of argument faced strong backlash, as it was seen by many as an attempt to justify violence. In response, the prosecution underscored that Oscar's actions were deliberate and calculated. They pointed out that he had been aware of the relationship for months and had even hired a private investigator to follow his wife. The private investigator's reports found in Oscar's safe showed that he had been methodically gathering evidence of Mila's meetings with the pastor. This suggested that his jealousy had been simmering for a long time, rather than being a sudden emotional reaction. The prosecution's most compelling argument came in the form of a meticulously reconstructed timeline of the night of the murder. They presented evidence showing that Mila had left the pastor's home at approximately 9:30 p.m., And less than an hour later, surveillance cameras recorded Oscar's car approaching the property. The murder was estimated to have occurred shortly thereafter. The prosecutor highlighted that Oscar had no credible alibi for the critical hours and emphasized his attempts to cover up the crime by tampering with evidence. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Their verdict was unanimous. Oscar Harper was found guilty of premeditated murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his closing remarks, the judge stated that the crime was driven not just by jealousy, but by a deep-seated need for control, which ultimately led to a tragic and senseless loss of life. The trial brought closure to one of the year's most high-profile cases, but it left a lasting emotional impact on all involved. Mila Harper, though free, found her life forever altered by the events. The community that once revered Pastor Henry Doyle as a moral leader struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the revelations that emerged during the trial. For Detective Thomas King, the case was a victory but not a triumph. He knew that the tragedy had been fueled by human weaknesses, jealousy, manipulation, and unchecked emotions that turned lives upside down and destroyed what once seemed unshakable. The case forced him to confront the complex nature of morality and the devastating consequences of choices made in moments of passion. The verdict brought an end to the trial, but the story remained a stark reminder of the fragile line between love, control, and destruction. It was a case that would be remembered for years to come, not just for its shocking events, but for the painful truths it revealed about the darker sides of human relationships. The conviction of Oscar Harper marked the conclusion of one of the most high-profile criminal cases in recent years. Yet even after his sentencing, the repercussions of the tragedy continued to ripple through the lives of all those connected to the tangled web of events. The unraveling of a love triangle that had led to Pastor Henry Doyle's death left deep scars on the community and on the principal figures involved. For Mila Harper, this experience signaled the beginning of a new but immensely difficult chapter in her life. Following Oscar's sentencing, she sold their luxurious home in New Jersey and moved to another state, seeking refuge from the relentless scrutiny of the media. She settled in a small town where no one knew her, trying to start over. However, rebuilding her life after the scandal proved far more challenging than she had anticipated. While she had been cleared of any involvement in the murder, part of society still judged her morally complicit. Rumors and whispers followed her, even in her new home, as her name occasionally resurfaced in news stories as a reminder of the infamous tragedy. Mila also struggled with her own emotional burdens. She was haunted by guilt, knowing that her actions, however indirectly, had contributed to Pastor Henry's death. Nightmares of that fateful night and memories of the events that had unfolded plagued her, making it difficult to move forward. She sought therapy to cope with the trauma. But even years of counseling could not fully heal her wounds. Her attempts to return to a normal life felt like an ongoing battle with a past that refused to let her go. The community of Pastor Henry Doyle, too, remained fractured in the wake of his death. To many, he had been a spiritual leader, a moral example, and a source of guidance. However, the revelations of his romantic involvement with a married woman tarnished his image. Some parishioners refused to believe the allegations, defending Henry's integrity and dismissing the accusations as slander. Others, however, felt betrayed, questioning not only his character, but also the church he had led. The congregation, once a close-knit community, was divided. Many members left the church, while those who stayed struggled to find new leadership that could rebuild their trust. For Detective Thomas King, the case became one of the most challenging and thought-provoking of his career. While he succeeded in solving the murder and securing Oscar Harper's conviction, the resolution brought little satisfaction. Thomas knew this crime was not a simple act of violence. It was a story of human frailty, jealousy, manipulation, and the collapse of trust. He often reflected on whether the tragedy could have been avoided if Henry, Mila, and Oscar had made different choices. The case forced him to confront complex questions about morality, relationships, and the emotional forces that drive people to extreme actions. At a broader societal level, the story of Pastor Henry Doyle's murder sparked widespread discussion. It became a cautionary tale about how hidden passions and conflicts can destroy even the most seemingly stable lives. News outlets extensively covered the case, analyzing it not just as a crime but as a social phenomenon. Documentaries, articles, and talk shows delved into the dynamics of power, control, and emotional abuse, using the Harper story as an example of how toxic relationships can escalate into tragedy. Oscar Harper, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, never admitted his guilt. According to his lawyers, he continued to insist that he acted out of betrayal and provoked anger. However, the court and public opinion were unanimous in their judgment. His desire for control and his inability to manage his emotions had led to devastating consequences. His imprisonment stood as a lasting reminder of how unchecked jealousy and a sense of entitlement could spiral into irreparable damage. The quiet suburban neighborhood in New Jersey where the tragedy began was forever changed. The murder of Pastor Henry Doyle shattered 3 lives and left a scar on the entire community. The story served as a sobering reminder of how fragile the line can be between love, control, and hatred, and how crossing it can lead to consequences that reverberate far beyond the people directly involved.